Hello everybody, my name is Kamala Dawar and I'm the author of this report on promoting small businesses in public procurement. I'm just going to briefly run through the report, its key findings and conclusions. I hope that you have the full document with you and the slides so that you can look at the information, data and sources in more detail. The objectives of this study were really to find out more about how small businesses were participating in government procurement markets domestically and internationally in selected countries. We chose 5 member states of the EU that were thought to be complementary to the Brazilian economy and culture, and they were Portugal, Spain, France, Italy and Greece. And these 5 member states had less research on their participation than some of the Nordic member states. We wanted to see if signing a public procurement agreement would actually improve the participation of small businesses in public procurement markets, not only abroad but also at home, and in doing so find some key policy recommendations to take forward. We know that public procurement is very critical. It's a good portion of the economic activity. It's a large part of government expenditure, and it is also a critical tool of public policy and good economic governance through transparency, non-discrimination and corruption control. Now, the value of public procurement in 2012 was significant. In the EU, 1.8 trillion, in the US, 1.7 trillion US dollars, and in Brazil, 637 billion real. In Brazil, that in 2014 represented 8.2% of GDP and 7.7% on a global average, slightly less than the Brazilian figure. Now, small businesses constitute a large percentage of all business activity, and there are some features of public procurement that should be compatible and complementary to the activities of small businesses. So, for example, most public procurement takes place at the state and local level, and that is where small businesses operate, and they're more familiar with the local conditions, and that should give them some kind of home bias or competitive advantage over larger firms with even greater economies of scale but located elsewhere. Also, procurement agencies are splitting lots down into smaller contracts, which makes them more attractive for smaller businesses with less capacity. However, these small businesses still do not hold their representative share of the public procurement market. In the EU, there are studies that show that this is 29% lower than they should be participating. In Brazil, it was found between 2013 and 2017 that the federal government was spending only 26% contracting micro and small businesses. So there's room for improvement given the importance of small businesses. What are small businesses? Small businesses are defined differently depending on the jurisdiction and the institution you're discussing. In the EU and Brazil, there's a fairly simplified method which is based on the size of the business and the annual sales or the annual gross income of the previous year. And in Brazil, they do not classify medium-sized businesses under this category in the federal complementary law. In the US, there's a much more fragmented approach which takes account of industry-specific trends and conditions. And so what is an SME will vary depending on the industry, the employment and the revenue of a business. This makes it much less transparent and accessible for businesses to enter. In Mercosur, there isn't a harmonised definition. It's based on the member states' definitions. Now, here's a whole list of challenges for small businesses. I don't want to go into them all, but they show basically how onerous some of the requirements of tendering are for a small business relative to a larger business. They also show that some small businesses don't have the right skills and training. Some government procurers are risk averse dealing with a small business. Lengthy payment intervals can really disrupt the cash flow of a business and makes it less attractive as a prospective bid. There are also other accountability problems. In the US, a study showed that the cost per employee due to regulation in procurement is 36% higher in small firms than in medium-sized and large firms. So it is significant, the burden that small businesses face. So governments turn to policy measures to try and promote small businesses. In Brazil, the complementary federal law provides a price preference margin for small businesses up to 10% and some offsets. This 10% price preference margin is only available if there are a minimum of 3 competitive small business bids, and all of those bids are able to demonstrate that they can perform the contract. The company has to be established in Brazil, and if it's an e-procurement method, the margin of preference will fall from 10 to 5%. Brazil is not a member of the WTO Government Procurement Agreement. It has observer status, so it has no obligations there. Under the Protocol of Public Procurement of the Mercosur, there are non-discrimination, transparency, competitive tendering requirements and procedures, and a bid challenge mechanism requirement for those procurements that are scheduled into the protocol above specified value thresholds. There's also an article that facilitates participation through transparency and also allows members the discretion to implement preferences or offsets to small businesses in their procurement contracts. So it has significant policy space there. In the EU, in addition to the single market, which is based on the 4 freedoms and non-discrimination, there is the European Directive on guidance on adapting procurement processes to the needs of small businesses, the Small Business Act, the European Code of Best Practices to facilitate access by small businesses to procurement, and of course, importantly, the EU competition laws, which apply to government bodies that are undertaking unfair business practices when they are undertaking an economic activity. So there is quite a lot of different regulation that applies to businesses that is in the interest of small businesses in the EU. The EU is a member of the WTO GPA, and significantly they have not negotiated the ability to provide set-asides or price preferences for small businesses in the EU. This is a policy decision that's based on harnessing the benefits of trade liberalisation and competition, and also it's based on the single market and promoting a single economic market within the EU. So this means that the EU is not able to implement price preferences or offsets on those procurement contracts that are covered by the WTO. Now, turning to the individual performance of the member states, in France we can see that actually from this snapshot France performs relatively well in state aid and procurement. However, in terms of small business involvement in the single market, it does behave, it does show that small businesses are performing below the single market indicators. In Greece, again, small businesses are performing well within state aid and public procurement. However, when it comes to internationalisation, they're performing significantly lower. In Italy, we see a significantly lower performance in state aid and public procurement for small businesses, and this is also the case for their small business participation in the single market and within internationalisation. Portugal, again, slightly lower than the EU average performance of small businesses in state aid and public procurement, but those businesses do behave well and perform well within the single market and internationally. Spain, the small businesses perform significantly worse than the EU average in state aid and public procurement. They're also lower in the single market indicators, although internationalisation is at the EU average. So we can see that even within the EU, there are significant obstacles to cross-border procurement participation by SMEs. A lot of this boils down to the fact that they're not as competitive and they can't win on those grounds. There's lack of access to finance to support the bid, lack of information, lack of capacity to undertake a contract, and of course those cultural linguistic obstacles. Nevertheless, the research did also suggest that there are demonstrated benefits to be had from certain policies, notably lot splitting and aggregation. Contracting agency behaves efficiently and professionally, dealing with payments promptly and being fair. transparency and standardization using e-procurement. An interesting tool is insurance against late payment, and of course ensuring enough finance, for example through the Small Business Leaders Programme in Portugal. So there are demonstrated benefits from those policies. There was less evidence to support the benefits of price preferences and offsets. However, this could be to do with lack of research. It's not easy to find case studies on the effects or the impacts of these offsets. So to sum up, we know that small businesses aren't participating enough, and we need to do something about that, and that's on the domestic, regional and international front. However, their participation in international contracts via a trade agreement is unlikely if they're not sufficiently competitive at home. In this situation, offsets and price preferences actually may undermine this drive for competitiveness, because they can affect a distortive behaviour on businesses and business activity, a kind of moral hazard. So on the other hand, trade agreements such as the WTO GPA can certainly provide legislative push and policy lock-in, which is in the long-term benefits of reform. And there are also those benefits of trade liberalisation to be had in terms of innovations and better products and so forth, and entering into those supply chains. However, this can only happen if there's a domestic industrial strategy that's effective and it's implemented properly. And if alongside that there are targeted flanking social policies to ensure that the losers from trade liberalisation are addressed and brought into the economy in a positive way. So I'll leave it there. I hope that you find the report beneficial, and I welcome any comments from you.